Hi everyone, I'm Carl Miller. I'm with Broadcom, and I want to talk to you about service virtualization and continuous integration. And I'm going to do most of this with Jenkins, but I want to give you some typical use cases that you can use SV for in continuous integration. So, use cases. You can create a virtual service from, say, WSDL, Swagger, RR pairs, even a combination of like Swagger and RR pairs, etc., so that you could have a virtual service created on the fly for whatever test you needed. For example, you need to test a component and you need to pull in RR pairs, requests and responses for that specific test. You could create the virtual service from just those RR pairs, deploy it out to a virtual service environment, run your test, and then delete it. You can also take a virtual service that maybe you've stored in a source control management, and you can change the port it listens on so that you can deploy it to different environments. So you could have one MAR file of that virtual service, and you could have it listen on different environments based on your environment, such as Dev, QA, or UAT. And the third one I'll demonstrate is you can create a virtual service from a recording. You can actually create a recording, create the virtual service, and then deploy it somewhere else, or save it to a source control management system. Where this would be extremely useful is you could create a virtual service in your final QA, UAT test, whatever, save off that virtual service and store it with the code so it could be used for a break fix. So let me talk to you about the tools we'll be using. Obviously, I'm going to use Jenkins because it's the most popular continuous integration tool. And we have a Jenkins plugin available in the Jenkins marketplace. Capabilities: start, stop, deploy virtual services, deploy tests and suites, display the test or suite results, whole bunch of cool things. Full support of Jenkins pipeline scripting, and I'll show you that. You can also use the DevTest REST APIs, and I'll show those too. Easily create Jenkins build steps, Jenkins freestyle projects, control tests and suites. You can do everything almost in code. So very cool with pipeline scripting, allows very complex CI/CD flows. So REST APIs, mentioned this before, using Jenkins pipeline, curl, HTTP request plugin. Those are things that you do want to have. So when you set up your Jenkins, you want to put those plugins in. You want the HTTP request plugin, you want the pipeline utility steps. If you're on Windows, I recommend getting curl for Windows. So let's go look at the demo. So I've got my portal open. I just have one virtual service up here. I've got my forward cars running because I'm going to use that to demonstrate on one of my use cases. I'll be using these DevTest services. So the APIs, I'll be using the API 2, that is Lisa virtualize-invoke API v2. This is the latest one in 10.4, in 10.0 through 10.4. The Invoke 2 is an earlier model, API/DCM. And the big difference between these two that's easy to see is one of these returns an XML. They both do use authorization, so you will need to pass that. So as you can see, this returns in XML, and this one returns in JSON. So you will need to know a little bit about parsing JSON when you're doing this. So let me bring over some. Okay, here we go. So I'm using the Service Virtualization plugin. Let's go back. Here are my installed plugins. The really ones you want that maybe not on there are the HTTP request plugin. Allows you to send an HTTP request. And the SV plugin. Sorry, it's up here. CA Service Virtualization plugin. So that allows you to do use it in anything. So the first thing I'm going to demonstrate is building a virtual service from Swagger and RR pairs. So I'm going to retrieve Swagger and RR pairs from GitHub. That's no big deal. It's basically built into the Jenkins product. I'm going to create a virtual service from Swagger. Then I'm going to load RR pairs for specific responses. With the APIs and Jenkins, you could do these kind of things. I'll create a VS-MAR file and download it into my Jenkins workspace and deploy it out. I'll run a test. I'll stop the virtual service. I'll undeploy the VS, and optional is you could store that MAR file back up in GitHub for use later on. So let's look at what this looks like in the pipeline mode. This is a pipeline. So in pipelines, you have nodes and you have stages. I've got some variables here that'll change per environment. These could, of course, become Jenkins parameters. If you wanted to parameterize that, you just have to go up here and say this project is parameterized and build the parameters in. So as we go down here, I'll need like the DevTest server, the name of the VSE server, what I'm going to call my service, a description of my service, some pieces for my transaction protocol. I'm going to be deploying this. I'm going to have a recording endpoint of 7015 is where I'm going to put my service at. I've got some data protocol information. I know my RR pairs are going to be REST, so I'm going to put a REST data protocol in, and JSON data protocol because they're in JSON also. I've got some other things here. What's my pattern of my files going to be so that I can pull down the correct files. Plugin information. This is primarily the one right here. I'm going to need is my credential ID. So I have stored my credentials in Jenkins so that I can just use them without putting in my user IDs and passwords, etc. So pull down GitHub, then I'm going to get the VSE ID. This is the API call to get the VSE ID. Like I said, you need to know a little bit about JSON to pull some things out. So JSON builder, read JSON.text, start out with the HTTP request. That is one of those plugins I mentioned. The reason it's really nice to use this one is the syntax isn't different between Windows, Linux, Mac. It's great. So I recommend using that for as much as you possibly can. Curl is necessary for a few steps, but and you can use it if you want, if you're more familiar with it and you like it better. But HTTP request is nice for a lot of things. So I've got things, my parameters like VSE server, etc. down here. And I'm going to pull out my VSE ID. So this is going to be used throughout. That's why I set it be up in the node level before it got that. I can get the virtual service list. That's a list of virtual services that have already been, that are already on that VSE. Then I need to create a builder session. Please refer to my video on the APIs, the DevTest APIs, because I'm going to run through these a little quick. A builder session is just the overall container to allow you to build a virtual service. Transaction bundle, input container, this is where I'm going to load all my files into. So here's where I'm going to do this. I'm going to load a Swagger file. I'm going to load the accounts into my input container. So this is where I've got a file. So if we go down here, I can iterate through Swagger files. I can actually, using the APIs, load more than one, which is pretty cool. So in this case here, I'm using some curl to do this. And as you can see, the syntax is just a little different. It's a little bit different for Windows and for Linux. So that's why I recommend that you need to kind of know your syntax a little bit. I'm now going to load another Swagger file in. With the APIs, you can load more than one Swagger at a time. So then I'm going to load RR pair files for specific responses. I've got a file pattern I described. I'm going to go down in here and load up a whole bunch of files. I'm basically iterating through the files and running through a whole bunch of RR pair files. I'm now going to create a transport protocol, which is my transport protocol, and those are using those values I defined above, like the recording port, the one that it will listen on. Then I call the API to process the data container, check the status so I don't go too fast. Then I've got some cleanup, just deleting a few things out of memory. Create a bundle processor, check that status once it's going. Once it's done, delete that. I'm going to check that my data protocols and add in my REST data protocol. This is a little bit important for REST. This variable here actually evaluates to a blank array, and the user configured says false. That tells DevTest, look at the REST calls, REST that's been put in there, and create the rules from those what you see in the files. You could pass in a definitive array if you wanted to, but this works better for if you're not sure what exactly the rules are. Now I'm going to create a MAR file and download it to the Jenkins workplace. Once again, I've used the HTTP request. This is simply going to just call it make this call. The call is using this VS Builder session ID, and it's going to download it to a file, service name.mar, which will be in my Jenkins workspace. I'm going to do a little cleanup here. I'm going to deploy the MAR file. Now this is going to actually use the Jenkins plugin, SV deploys virtual service. So in this case, I've given it a host. I've told it where the MAR file is. I've given it a port. Token credentials, these are again credentials I have stored in my Jenkins instance, so they would change if you had a different Jenkins instance. Use custom registry is true, and the VSE name is parameterized. You could also deploy this using the REST APIs, like curl or whatever, in which case you're going to use the invoke to the DCM API to deploy. At this point then, I'm going to run a test against that service. I could run it using the application test plugin, or in this case, I'm going to use the virtual service API. So since I'm running this on Windows, it's going to be the Lisa-test-invoke API v1. For tests, it's v1. For virtual services, it's v2. I'm going to run those tests and give it that test file name. I've got a little sleep time in here. That's just to allow it to hold up for a little bit before it runs, stops the virtual service, and undeploys the virtual service. This is so we can actually see it run on the portal. And then I've got an optional stage to store my MAR file on my GitHub, because that will allow me to take what I've created and push it back up there to use again. So let's go run this. I'm going to shrink this down a little bit, so we'll be able to see it and also see what's going on in my DevTest portal. So here we go. I'm going to kick off this build now. Scroll down a little bit. There we go. It's starting to work. So I pulled the Swagger RR pair. As you can see, it's already, that's the name. I created my virtual service with Swagger RR4. So it's starting that. It's creating the builder session. As soon as you create a builder session, you're going to get this recording in there. I've loaded the Swagger. I'm now loading the RR pairs for my specific responses. So I'm downloading this to the workspace, and then I'm going to upload it to this VSE up here. So there we go. It's up and running. It's got 2 transactions. I'm running my test, etc. So let's refresh this here. So it's offline, but it had the 6 transactions. So I got some demo wait time in there. Otherwise, this would be just too fast for you. I'm undeploying it now, and it's gone. So there we go. If I'd wanted to, I'd store it up in the GitHub. Very easy to do. It can be parameterized. You could have this watching a folder. So if you dropped RR pairs in, etc., you could easily do this for for your CI that you need. So let's look at another common use case, which would be to change the port of a MAR file. So in this case, I'm going to use the CARS REST virtual service that are found in your samples. The MAR file has ports of 7000 for the live CSP, 7001 for the virtual service. This demo is I'm going to pull that MAR file down from GitHub, deploy the virtual service on port 7114 with a live invocation port of 7002. So this is going to allow you to, this is going to show how you could have one virtual service, a MAR file, but you can deploy it based on your need. So if we look into the configuration, this is going to be a little bit different than what we just saw. So in this case here, the big thing is my transport properties, including hosts and ports. I'm going to deploy it to 7114, but I'm also going to change the target endpoint, which would come back from it. It would come back on 7000 and from the deployed MAR, and I'll show that in the console output after this runs. So as we look down here, I'm going to retrieve project from GitHub. It's got that MAR file in there. I've got to get the virtual service. I'm going to get the virtual service list. That's optional. But you might want to do that just in case you actually had the virtual service running and you needed to replace it. So you could get the virtual service list, check to see if it's on there, and undeploy the one you don't want. I'm going to create a builder session with MAR. So I'm going to find that virtual service that I've downloaded to my workspace, cars-rest.mar, in that file. So I'm then going to do my response builder with that MAR file. So I'm going to post that one up, builder session, my authorization basic. In this case, since I have to tell it content type zip to give it that, to let it know that I'm going to be uploading a MAR file with this. Okay. Notice one of the things is if you're building a service from Swagger or RPairs, you have to tell it what the service name is. If you're pushing a MAR file up, it figures that out from the MAR file. So then I'm going to call a get call to get the transport protocol down. And then I'm going to do an update on the transport protocol, which will be a put call, HTTP node put. I'm going to give it the information in variables that it needs, the type ID, the base path, the use gateway, the recording endpoint, the host and port, and then the target endpoint, host and port, which would be my live invocation, which will change the live invocation. Then I'm going to create the MAR file. I'm going to deploy it, start it, and do a little bit of cleanup, and then get the virtual service list afterwards. So let's save that. Shrink this down a little bit. So we've got just one running, and click Build Now. So there it's running. As you can see, I've got this up here. Down just a little further. There we go. We've got a, we've redeployed this up very easily with a port of 7114. And if we pull this open in Jenkins, if we look at the console output, let me make this a little bit bigger for you. So here's the response transport protocol output. This is from my get call. Sending a request to get the transport protocols. And you can see I'm coming back. It was on port 7001. It was on that port of 7001. And then once I sent it back up, it was going to be on 7002. I mean, the live endpoint would be, target endpoint would be 7002. And my recording endpoint port is 7114. So this is good, very useful in CI because you just have to have the one MAR file, but you can deploy it out to multiple environments just by using this these techniques. So the last one is a recording. So in this case, I'm going to retrieve a project from GitHub. I've got the steps all marked out here. Get the VSID, service list of those deployed. I'm going to create a builder session, create a transport protocol, add my data protocol, add an additional data protocol, which is optional. I'm going to start a recorder. I'm going to execute a test that will go through the recorder. I'm going to publish a report. I'm going to stop the recorder. I'm going to create the MAR file from my recording. I'm going to deploy it to a VSE, and then I'm going to execute a test against the VSE, and finally do a little bit of cleanup. Let's go out here and let's kill this. Say OK. Now this is actually going to run the test doing a recording, but going against my forward cars back end that I have down running here. So the only thing really different about this one if we run into the configuration, is I've got these calls after I've created that is start the recorder. In this case, it's using the API v2, and it just says start a recorder. Okay, but you do have to tell it. You do have to start a recorder, and it basically starting the recorder will use the transport protocol, that information that you created up here, so it knows what port it's going to record on, and that just like you kind of do with the portal. Then I'm going to execute a test using, once again, the Jenkins plugin to deploy a test. After that, I'm going to publish a test report. I'm going to stop the recorder. I'm going to create the zip. I'm going to deploy that zip using the Jenkins plugin. I'm going to execute another test against this, and then I'm going to do a little cleanup. So let's save that. Scroll this down just a little bit so we can watch and say build now. There we are, it's running, getting a virtual servers list. If I refresh there, I've got a recording up and running. One thing, you won't see the transactions going against that recording. So you're not going to see a transaction count. It's not something going wrong on your end, it's just the way it works. But as you can see, we have executed a test. I'm going to publish a recorder, stop the recorder, create a virtual service MAR file. Deploying that, I now have my cars recording up there and running, and I'm executing a test against it. There we go. Got 5 transactions. So if we go there, got 21 transactions. 23, I think that's it. There we go. And we're done. So in this case, you can create this recording based on at the end of, say, you could create the recording at the end of your UAT or QA test, and then save this recording off, this virtual service off, for use later on in break-fix testing, etc., because it would be your final back end. You could have a good recording of your back end systems, and you could obviously have more than one recorder going if you wanted to. So that's an example of the DevTest stuff in CI. Very powerful, lots of good things you can do with it. Once again, these are the use cases I demonstrated: creating a virtual service for Swagger and RR pairs. I changed the port of a virtual service, pulling down from source control management. And I created a virtual service from a recording and deployed it out. So good use cases, obviously very useful for CI. So have fun with this. It's very powerful and a great tool for your CI/CD. Thanks very much.